Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chats on the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and self-publishing. And today we are very, very happy to welcome a very special guest who has an absolutely wonderful backdrop full of books and a roaring log fire. Becky Ellis, a writer, author of a memoir, here to talk to us about writing memoirs. How are you doing, Becky?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we're delighted to have you. I do love your backdrop. Everyone normally has fake backdrops, and then look at yours. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you. It's my little office that I work in, so I love it.
And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing well, thank you, Roland, and thanks for coming on, Becky. So the idea of writing memoirs, that's what we want to sort of talk about today, because a lot of authors that listen to this probably are fiction authors, and other people who maybe haven't written anything at all but have a story to tell. They want to about their own lives. They want to write memoirs, but I imagine, not having written a memoir myself, that the process of writing a memoir and the research involved and all the different things that go into it are very different than writing fiction. So we want to talk about sort of those differences and what it takes to write a memoir. So that is what we want to sort of focus on. But why don't you start off by telling us a bit about yourself and your writing process, or the life that you've led as a writer, and what your memoir is about, and what led you to writing that, and then we can go from there.
That sounds fantastic. So this, as Roland pointed out, my backdrop of books and a fire, this is where I write. And my writing process is I spend about 4 hours every morning writing, or at least when I was deep in the writing process, that's what I did for the memoir. And I've been in publishing for 25 years, and I've been writing for the past 10 years. I worked in the sales and marketing department of Time Inc. for quite a while, about 20 years. I also had worked in book distribution before that. So I'm familiar with the industry, and I wanted to take a shot at writing because I had a story to tell. And the story that I wanted to tell is that my dad was a combat sergeant in World War II. And he came home with 13 medals and a Silver Star and was this hero. But life was tough. He was he was a hard man to love, and we wanted to love him. He pretty much had a severely wounded soul. He was an alcoholic. He had PTSD, that whole thing. And no one really talks about this. No one talks about there's kind of a military wall, and no one talks about what it's like to be raised by people that have been in the military. And I wanted to kind of lift that veil and break down that wall and share what it's like. And my dad, when he was 89, he came to me and my home and asked if I had any issues to clear up. And I had a ton of issues because my dad married 4 times, fathered 8 kids. He kind of traded wives and children like other people trade cars. And there were lots of things that went on. And I wanted to hear about the war because I thought that's where his issues came from. And he broke 70 years of silence and talked to me about the war. And when he did that, I thought, I got to tell this story. So it's the story of my childhood. It's also the story of his experience in combat. And then it's a story of the conversation we had at the end of his life. And so it's about reconciliation and connection. So it's really, and this is what memoir is. There's the situation, and then there's the story, as Vivian Gornick puts it. And so my story is, what I call it is the of and the about. My story is of a young girl struggling to love her father and survive that childhood. It's a story of a combat sergeant and the story of reconciliation, but it's really a story about the human capacity for suffering and compassion. And so with memoir, you get really specific, and with fiction too, right? You get really specific and close to your characters, and you get into their life, and it's a story of that, but it needs to have a more universal truth to it. And that's what the story is about. And in writing memoir, it's no different than in writing fiction, that really needs to be present.
Wow, yeah. I wonder, I imagine that when you are thinking about the marketing of a book, like any kind of memoir, you have to also think about who you're writing it for in terms of the audience as well, because you have to know who to target your marketing towards. I imagine that there's probably some subset of people that just read memoirs and that's their favorite genre, right? They just want to read about people's lives. But there's probably also that subset where you're going to be specifically targeting, say, war vets or people, people interested in father-daughter relationships, or that sort of thing, right? So is that sort of also sort of weighing in your mind as you're writing it, thinking about who you're targeting it, or do you just figure that out afterwards?
So coming from a marketing background, having been the director of marketing for 20 years, pretty much, I always have that in my mind. However, I think when we start writing memoir, we need to scrub our minds of that in order to really do the deep psychological excavating required to do memoir. And I think that we need to have a really messy first draft that is scribbled all over, that is just for us, so we can actually find our story. And I feel like I am still trying to figure out who the target audience for this book is, to be perfectly honest, because it is really for, it's really for families and spouses of vets. It's also for vets, but it's also for civilians, to kind of look behind that wall and to really have an understanding of what something else is. And I think that's why we read in general, is so we can enter someone else's world and someone else's life, whether that's science fiction or memoir or history. We want to learn and understand something. And the thing about memoir is that adults take in memoir like children take in fairy tales as a psychological practice to learn something. So whatever that memoir is dealing with, a lot of memoirs deal with survival. So we're kind of learning survival as we read memoir. And in my story, I think we're learning survival a little bit, but I think we're also learning compassion and conversation and how to deepen relationship. So if the memoirist can keep that in mind, what are you trying to teach the reader? What are they going to be practicing? And again, this is not first draft material. I think first draft, we're really digging for story, and we need to let our stories be big and rambling and all over the place. And a lot of memoirists that I've worked with in writers groups and also in teaching is that their stories get really big and rambling, and it's almost as if memoirists sometimes want to write their whole life when they're new to it, because they feel like the reader has to know everything in order to understand one thing. But as in fiction, you really only need to give the reader only what they absolutely must know. And memoir is really intended to be a slice of life that explains one piece of life. And that way it's manageable for the reader.
Wow.
And that's
oh, sorry, carry on.
No, go ahead. That's kind of the tricky part of memoir, is to kind of get rid of all the stuff. I probably wrote, I don't know. I wrote about 13 to 15 drafts of this book, and in word volume, it's about 70,000 words in total. And I'm sure I wrote over, I don't know, 700,000 words in the process, and got rid of so much. You got to be willing to kill your darlings. There's some beautiful stuff that's not published, that's not going to see the light of day.
Well, to me, it seems like such an amazing thing, because in some ways, writing a memoir, part of writing a memoir, normally when you write a book, it's like, I want to write for this target audience. I want this. Part of writing a memoir must be, I just want to write this down. I just want to have some record of this. So I have a record of it, and my family has a record of it. And I mean, I'm going through the whole process with my father, who's 86, and like just getting an entire map of his life, because otherwise when he dies, I didn't know him until he was in his 40s, because that's when I was born. And you have a whole person and a whole life that you're absent from. So to do what you're doing and to look at the big picture and then see a segment of it that takes a story and tells something, that seems to show such discipline in terms of being a writer and being a storyteller and thinking externally about what it is people get out of the memoir, just rather than just writing the memoir for the memoir's sake.
Exactly. And I really think in doing that, you have to keep the reader in mind. So, for example, when my father told me his story of wartime, it was 300 pages, just his story that I wrote down. And I created it in, with a climactic action in the beginning and the end, like the whole thing. It was structured, it was done well. It's 300 pages. It's now 32 pages. And it's in a completely different format and structure. And there were a lot of darlings killed in that process. But it was way too much horror and violence for the reader to take in. And I look at it like, a fine balsamic reduction is really what a story should be. It should be reduced down to just its essence and just the absolute beauty of it, and get rid of all the other stuff, because most of the other stuff just gets in the way. And with memoir, it's really hard because it's your life. And as Roland, as you're listening to your dad's story, you probably feel like it's all so important, but it's hard to say, yeah, that wasn't really important and that wasn't really important. And although it is important as we live it, it's not really important to the story. It's not, the reader can't take in all of that.
Right. So when you were writing this, did you have kind of a structure of a story planned out? I mean, when I write fiction stories, I use like a story circle and go through. And when I was getting my father's life down, like to me, there was a certain story that was there. But how did you go around it? Where did you got all of this? How did you build the framework of a story into something that really happened?
So I studied fiction in order to write this memoir, because I wanted it to read like fiction. And it pretty much does. So I studied story structure, the 3-part structure, with the inciting incident, the first climax, the first action, the second with all the pitch points. I had it all charted and structured that way, so it would follow and read like fiction, because I think that's the way that readers are most engaged. And having come from publishing, I know that works. And it actually wasn't working with my memoir. And a lot of memoirists don't necessarily follow that. And it's not that way anymore. It's actually a very unconventional structure at this point. It's a 3-part structure where it's broken down into those 3 parts that I talked about. But each of those 3 parts actually has its own story structure in it. And so that's what kept me focused and on point and able to cut out scenes and cut out scenes and cut out parts of my life and say, okay, 25 things that happened in my life, 25 scenes I've written, really are all the same. They really offer the reader one experience. For example, I had to get my teeth drilled as a child without Novocaine. And there were many moments of my childhood where my father wanted me to be tough as nails, and he toughened me up in all these different ways. And so I had written many things about, when I had 100 needles put in my arm because I broke it and had electric shock there. And I'd written all this stuff about kind of the one thing. And that one thing was my father wanting me to be tough as nails. And so I got rid of all the other stuff and kept the 5 pages. And that takes a ton of discipline, like you're talking about. It really does. And practice. Takes practice.
What I probably should have sort of asked this at the beginning, but the difference between a memoir and a biography, I'm not sure that they're exactly the same, right? Like, so what is the difference?
So a biography is when you write about someone else's life, and it's usually someone of historical significance. There are biographies about presidents and explorers and this and that kind of thing. And an autobiography is usually about it's someone of historical significance as well, but it's this happened and then this happened and then this happened. I was born on this date. This is where this was my beginning years. Then this was my elementary years. And so it's a series of marching through time. And memoir isn't like that at all. Memoir is, like I was saying, it's a slice of life to show the reader an experience that a person had, and to make that personal experience universal. Like I said, to teach something. It's a practice, right?
Right. Okay, so it's not so the memoir is just looking at a bit of it, as opposed to the biography or autobiography that's looking at the whole life. Your memoir is focusing on a very important part of the life that would ideally have some sort of other message within it.
Right. So a memoir might be about, a divorce, or it might be about winning a gold medal, but it's not going to be about the entire life of that person, right? It can be about triumph or tragedy or whatever you want it to be about, but it's going to just be a slice of life, not the whole life. Exactly.
So, and then I guess when there's biography and autobiography, one is about someone else, one is about yourself. Memoir is, in your case, you're writing sort of about both of you, yourself and your dad, but I guess there's no distinction in that sense. There's no auto memoir or non-auto memoir. So, yours is really just almost like it's both, which is, I guess, what also makes it difficult. It's easier, I'm sure, to cut something from his life that is, he might think it's all important, but it's easier as a third person to say, yeah, those are good, important things, but to the story, I can cut them. But then when you have to cut stuff about your own life, it's a lot harder, because then you're like, but no, that is really important, and it's like,
well, this is a really interesting question and topic, because it was actually much harder for me to cut things out of my father's life, because with memoir, you really have to get in, you really have to know thyself, and you really have to get into your psychological landscape. And the psychological landscape of being raised by a war hero is, who am I? Who am I, and what significance is my life compared to this man that has 13 medals and lasted 172 days on the battlefields of World War II? Like, I'm nothing. And that is the psychological complex I carried around my whole life. And there was a point in writing my memoir where my writing mentor said, where are you in this story? Your dad is so big and so present. Where are you? And so I laid every page out on the floor. It was about 300 pages at that point, and I put a marking on it. One page had a D for dad and one had a B for Becky. And my father owned about 70% of the pages. And that's because he owned that much psychological landscape of my own psyche and mind. And it was really challenging for me as a person to let myself be the protagonist in the story. And, writing a memoir, it really transforms someone. It's when people read memoir, they expect to be reading a book from a transformed person who has something to offer, some wisdom to deliver to a reader. And I had to get through that process. I had to believe that my story was as significant as my father's, and come out the other side, in this transformed kind of place. So sometimes it takes longer to write memoir. I have not heard of someone whipping one out in, 12 months.
Well, I think that, especially if it's not completely about yourself, it's going to take more time just to draw that story out of the other person and all those details and dig into them. And I'm sure that it's written over, I know I've read a few memoirs. I remember one, I think it was the Steve Jobs one. And I think that the person had, met with Steve over many, I think, weeks or months, talking with him and pulling out stories before he was able to put that book together. So it's I think it's one thing if it's just about something about your life, you know, you can sit there and you can type it out and it's all in your head, right? But it's different when you have to discuss it with the other person, especially when in the writing process you discover there's things that you need to dig deeper on. You've now got to go back. It's not like if it was yourself and you realize that, but okay, you just sit back and think about it. Okay, you know, what happened then? But now you have to go and talk to your dad again, or you know, each time to pull out more bits of those stories when you realize that they were important for you to include. So yeah, I can totally see that.
Right. And, you know, most memoirs, a lot of people don't consult their family. There's kind of a discussion about this. Is some people say, don't talk to your family about it. Other people really want their family involved in it. And I suppose some people, it's not safe to speak with their family about it. It's not safe to share it. For me, and like you were talking about Steve Jobs, I wanted to include my father's story in it, which makes it completely unconventional. Most memoirs are pretty much about one person. It's quite unusual. You know, it's about one person, but family is also involved. You know, their interaction in the world is involved, so other people are involved. And mine, I wanted to tell my father's story too, because his story I felt was incomplete without mine, and I felt that my story was inconceivable without his. Readers needed to understand the backstory of it. And backstories also really, you know, you want to keep the reader engaged in your story and moving along in your story. So you don't want to be constantly throwing them into backstory. And that's the ultimate reason why I structured it the way I did, is because I wanted them to completely be in my childhood with me and get to the end of part one really disliking my father. Because that's kind of the way I experienced life. Although I loved him, I really didn't like him either. And then you get in mine, it's 2 sentences of transition, and you're 50 years earlier on the battlefields of World War II, and you're marching through the field with him. And so I thought that would be a much more effective way to handle backstory, is to just give it to the reader all at once, rather than a bit here and a bit there, and so forth.
And I mean, and that's going to obviously create a little bit more compassion to how he treated you, because you're including that story and showing people that he wasn't just like that because he wasn't a good person or whatever. It was because of what he went through, which in most cases, I think in life is the case. A person acts the way they do because of their of how they were brought up, what they went through. But when we're walking through our lives and dealing with those people, we don't know their backstories, and so we just think, oh, they're a jerk or whatever. So I think it's great that you, even though you had that sort of feeling that, you know, you really didn't like him in part, or you know, you loved him, you didn't really like him in a lot of parts of your life, you still wanted to show readers why he was like that, and not just blame him for being a bad person. So I think that's great.
Right. And, you know, Roland touched on this earlier, where he's getting his father's story now, and he wasn't with him the first 40 years of his life. And I had this moment when my father was talking to me, and he reached a point in his story where it was so horrible that it was inconceivable to me. And for the first time, I saw my father as separate from myself. And I thought, wow, how often do we ever really see our parents as separate from ourselves, or our partners, or our children? And in seeing him as separate, all my needs for him as a parent, all my desires for who I wanted him to be, kind of fell away. And this thing happened in my writing, which is so important in memoir. It was taught to me by a teacher, and it was really hard for me to do until I could see my father separately. And that's being what's called a just God on the page, which pretty much means you're being a just and fair author. You're giving everybody reasons for doing what they do. Like, we have to do this in fiction, right? If you're writing about, I don't know, a mass murderer, you got to give him his reasons or her reasons for doing what that character is doing. Well, it's true in memoir as well. A lot of people start memoir from kind of a traumatized or angry place, and the writing feels really blaming. And there's this thing people say about memoir is write from the scar, not the wound. And I believe if you can get to the heart and you can write from your heart, not the scar or the wound, that it's much easier to be a just God on the page, because then you can see why people are doing what they're doing. And I have an example of this in my book, where when I was a young girl, around 9 years old, my dad took me to a nude beach. And things happened there that shouldn't have happened. And it was a little bit traumatic. And I had blamed my father for a long time for that. And then I thought, my God, how hard that must have been for him to be there on that beach after having been in combat, being fired at, always wearing his helmet, always having a gun with him, and then to strip everything off. And why did he do it? He did it because he was dating a 20-year-old woman. It was actually his wife. He was married to a young hippie that was half his age. And he did it because he wanted to show up for her. And once I was able to give him his reasons, it actually makes so much room for the reader to feel. So you're not, when the writer is giving every character their reasons, the reader feels everything instead of feeling what the writer is imposing on them. Even though as a writer, that's what we're doing, right? We're kind of leading the reader down this emotional place where we want them to get. But in memoir, we have to do it from the place of a just God, or the reader will only leave the story feeling like, well, that writer is angry, not, well, I'm angry.
Now, did you find that telling his story alleviated the sense of anger?
Yeah, I mean, talking to him and coming to a place of true compassion for who he was alleviated the anger. It healed so much in me. And then I was able to write from that place. And that's the deal with memoir. You got to write from that place from a place of having changed. And, I've heard that writing a book changes a person. I think writing a memoir changes a life. Most memoirists I know, from the time they started to the time they finished, their life looks totally different. And that's true of my life too. It looks really different than it did 10 years ago when I started down this process.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think, I think, as you said, like in fiction, it's important to give those backstories as well. But to me, it's far more important to give them in a memoir, to be fair to those people. And I get the idea of not, some people not wanting to even tell their families about it. But I mean, if you're including your families in your memoir, and especially if you're painting them in a negative light in any way, not telling them, I think, is pretty dangerous. But also, I mean, unless you're trying to destroy a relationship with your family, I think you pretty much want to make sure that you give their reasonings for why they did what they did. And so I think that's, in my opinion, it's far more important to do that for memoir than it would be for fiction. I mean, fiction, you see that all the time, right? They have, and I don't love it, but you see it all the time where, you have a villain and they don't really tell you why he's a villain. It's like, oh, he's bad for the sake of being bad. And I think it's a much better story when they show you the backstory of that villain. And so I think, but that's fiction, so it doesn't really matter if people come away thinking that person's just a bad person, right? But with memoir, you really want to make sure that you're giving the full story. And that person might still come off as a bad person. That's fine, right? But at least you want to give the information and, like you said, let the readers draw that conclusion for sure.
Well, and I think Dracula is a perfect example of that, as a totally fictionalized situation But once you find out his backstory, he's a villain. And once you find out his backstory, your heart completely minded, totally broke for this person, this horrible villain who's sucking the life out of people. And you find out how broken his heart is and why he's doing what he's doing. And that's when the author and the writer has you. They're like, oh my gosh, they have you now. They have you actually feeling bad for the villain. And that is so powerful. And in memoir, more than, some people are already estranged from their family when they write memoir. So I think even more than wanting to maintain good relationship with the family is what do you want to really express to your reader? What path do you really want to take them down? And if you want them to feel and not just feel you, then lead them down that path and give everybody reasons for doing what they're doing. Because then that opens space on the page for the reader to feel. And that's really what we want to do in, I think, almost anything that we write, whether we want them to feel joy or adventure or horror or thrill, or, we want them to feel something. I think that's really one of the reasons we all write.
I think it makes you come off as a more authentic writer too, if you're including everyone's backstories, right? If you don't, then the reader might be like, well, obviously this person has issues with this person and who knows what the reality is, right? But and then they might start questioning some of the other things that you're talking about because they say, okay, well, that's coming from this place and we don't even know. But if you gave that story and it shows that you're being fair and balanced and you're including everyone's perspective, I think that probably makes the entire thing come off much more authentically.
Right. And, we can practice this too, this being a just God. We can practice it when someone cuts us off in traffic. Instead of first being super angry, just be like, well, maybe there's a woman delivering a baby in that car, or, maybe they just got bad news. I do it in line at the grocery store, when someone's taking forever and I'm being impatient. I'm like, you know what? They have their reasons for wanting to tell their golfing story to the cashier, like whatever it is. I'm going to be fair and let them have their reasons. I think practicing in life what we do on the page can be so helpful to writers.
I like that because when you're writing a book, I mean, yes, you have bad guys and you can paint them in the story as bad guys, but everybody in the world is a bad guy in somebody's story, and everybody in the world is a hero in their own version of the story. And so it's interesting to play with that dichotomy.
Right. And in books that are so well loved, we find out a lot of times the villain's backstory and the villain's reasons for being being terrible or grouchy, or a man called Ove. I don't know if you read that, but it was wildly successful. And you find out about 6 chapters in that this really grumpy old guy, oh my gosh, his wife died, and that's why he's tragically grouchy, and it opens the heart to that, and it gets the reader to feel differently. It's brilliant when writers pull that off, I think.
Absolutely. Can you tell us anything about, I guess, some of the technical things that go into writing a memoir that might be different than fiction writing? I know one thing I think you mentioned before was, the idea of handling sort of backstory and time jumping around in sort of the timeline, which I think is something that would happen in a memoir more often than it would in a fiction. Obviously, there's fiction that does it too, and there's different ways to handling it. But I think in a memoir, that's probably fairly commonplace. And, what are sort of the ways that you can handle it and why you would choose one over the other? I think backstory is one of those ways, and I think obviously that allows you to tell that story, but you also have to make sure that the reader isn't getting confused if you're jumping around in the timeline as well, right?
Right. I think one of the things, I was thinking about this the other day, and I think one of the things we do as writers, whether it's memoir or fiction, and I think with memoir it feels different because we're trying to write something that is true, and we're sticking to the truth of our story. And so I was thinking about time, and we need to write in chronos time, time that is measured by the clock, right? It's time that marches forward. And we need to keep the reader grounded in that. But as storytellers, I think what we really are trying to do is to bring them out of their armchair or their wherever they're reading, and bring them into the story and bring them into Kairos time, which is deep time. It's timeless time. And I think that's why people read, is because they want to fall out of their chronological marching of their daily life and fall into deep time. And in writing and in memoir writing, I think that we need to be mindful of that, and be mindful that we need to keep the reader grounded in time. They need to know where they are in the story, in someone's life, but also be in this deep time where something else is happening. And the way, like I said earlier, we often want the reader to understand everything. Because we don't trust them enough. And so we go into backstory constantly. And we start, another thing we do, I think, in memoir that kind of drags the story down is we write an exposition. And something that is unusual about the memoir that I've written is it's almost all in scene, because I had an editor tell me, I want you to take out every line of exposition, every word of exposition in this story. Don't explain anything. Just tell the story in scene. So I did the exercise. I took everything out. And she said, when you're done taking everything out, you can then thread back in a couple little things. And what happens when it's written in scene, like fiction, the reader is fully engaged. There's no explaining going on, which is where people start explaining backstory often. Well, it's like this because of that, and I'm feeling this because of that. And we want to get away from that, I think, in memoir. And it's a little bit radical. Some memoir is written all in exposition. And I think what happens is we forget the story. And I think when we write in scene, it's memorable, because that's how we live our lives. We don't live our lives being explained things. We move through time and space. We live in scene. And so I think if we write in scene, it's much more powerful, it's much more engaging, and it's far more memorable. And backstory needs to be needs to happen in scene as well, the way that we're living. And so the way I was taught to handle backstory is, if you're sitting on a park bench and a church bell goes off, go into your backstory. The church bell, the ringing of the bell reminds you of something. Go into your short moment of backstory and then come back on the bell ringing. You need to go out and in on something physical, on an object or a sound or something that is a sensory detail. And you need to come back on that to signal to the reader we're back in the chronological time again. And so that's really how I was taught to handle backstory. That's the way I do it. And I think it's super effective in that way.
That is great advice. It's funny. I used to do a lot of editing for people, and one of the transition periods that is most difficult is when they have a flashback and then you come back and it's kind of, you do lose it. It's like, where are you in the thing? So what a great thing, a specific point. And yeah, that breaks it. And then, well, I learned something today.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. Writing it in scene is going to make it far more memorable to people. And I was thinking about that as you were saying it. And it's, yeah, when you're writing it in scene, you're allowing the reader to sort of almost take part in it and imagine it. Whereas if you're just telling a story, you're going to lose their interest, and it's just not as exciting, and then it's certainly not going to stick in their head. So yeah, I mean, I haven't read a ton of memoirs, but from what I can imagine, just from you describing it, I think that would be a far more powerful way. Although I'm sure there's a lot of memoirs that just wouldn't work. Yours is a more action oriented with the war stuff. Whereas I guess it depends on what the memoir is, but I imagine there are some where it's just harder to there's not a lot of action necessarily going on to be able to do that. Then maybe it would just be more dialogue, but yeah.
And one of the things that people get hung up on, I think, in writing memoir, and when it's not in scene and it's in exposition, it feels told and not lived. And so you want to get in scene, you want to stay in scene. And the hang up is, well, I don't remember everything exactly. And if you look at, I have this water skiing scene it's a chapter in my book. And if you really look at it, people have asked me, how do you remember everything? Well, I spent a lot of time on the Delta, the Sacramento Delta in California. I know exactly what that water looks like. It's murky, it's muddy. My feet were in the disgusting bottom of it more times than I like to say. I remember the tulies, so if you focus on just a few key images and you get really close to them and you let them do the hard work of the emotion for you, I believe in being not believe in it. I am a really imagistic writer, and getting close to just a couple objects and images like water, and let the water do all the hard work and just be with the water. You don't have to remember that much. And I think memoirists sometimes shy away from scene because they think, oh, I don't remember exactly what the kitchen looked like. But if you know what a couple of the objects in the kitchen look like, the stove or a light fixture, and get really close to those and let those do the hard work, that's really all you need. And that's, I think that is a way to bring the reader really close and to really write it in scene and not worry about everything else. You don't have to remember everything. You just have to remember a few key things.
That brings up a sort of a question about how important is it to get every single detail exactly right? I mean, obviously the reader's not going to know anyways, right? But often I'm watching something or reading more watching something because it's something where it's whether it's fictional or not, and it's told from one person's perspective, and then they have this scene where people are talking, that person's not there. It's like, how do you know what they said? How do you know that's exactly what was going on? And then, but that sort of makes me think about it. And even when you're writing memoir, I have a terrible memory. If I was going to write a memoir about something, there's plenty of stuff I won't remember. And so I guess the question is, how key is it that you only write about things that you can remember clearly and those facts, or is it acceptable to sort of add in some details that, it probably happened like this, and just make it, just write it as if it did happen that way, even though, you're not embellishing anything, certainly not on purpose, but like, you don't remember those things. So you're just going to sort of add them in because you need those details. And that's probably how it went, but you don't remember exactly, right?
Yeah. And, of course, we can't remember dialogue exactly as it happened, but I know my family's voices really well. And I know my brother and I, how we talk today is still sometimes how we talked as kids, and I remember the things he says and the things he said, and I just know his voice. I know my mom's voice. I know my dad's voice. They're really present with me. So did they say exactly the things the way it's written in the memoir? No, but it was probably really close. And as far as remembering the world around us, did I remember exactly the suit my mom wore at the time? No, but I remember she had this blue suit she used to wear. So I did things, and I know she drove a Mustang, in 1972. Did I remember exactly what the dashboard looked like? No, but what I did is I went back and I did some research online. I looked at what's a 1969 Mustang look like, because hers was a few years old, and that gave me what I needed. So there are things we can do to help our memory along. And if you want to get really specific about something, you can do some research and find out more about the world that you were really living in, right?
Yeah.
I remember when I was talking to my father about this, I said to him, oh, I remember this one time you told me this story. We were driving to school in your Volvo 480 and you told me this story and I found it so inspiring. He looked at me and was like, we never had that conversation in the car. And it turned out, and he explained to me that your different memories different parts of memories are held in different parts of your brain. So a memory for the conversation you had is held in a different part of the brain as the memories of objects and the memories of places and stuff like that. So I just assembled a memory that was roughly about, you know, what the conversation was about, but the rest of it was entirely, and it's funny when you sort of break things down like that. And it was, I think your approach to it is great, because it's about, at the end of the day, you know, how it made you feel, the significance of that connection that you had, rather than the details around it.
Exactly. Yes. And you want to get the essence of what you're trying to convey across. And, you know, the beach scene that I brought up before, I asked my brother, you know, my brother has read my whole book. And, you know, when he read it, he's a really important person to me then and now. And I wanted him to read the book prior to publication to make sure, you know, it was accurate in his mind too. He sent me, he works in computer technology, and he sent me a page 8-point font full of corrections, which was really funny, but they weren't, oh, this memory was off or that one was off. It was more like, oh, Dad's knives actually had black handles. They weren't brown handles. It was stuff that was so insignificant that it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the reader. And to your point, Roland, it's, you know, the memories are created in certain ways. If the handles were black versus brown, it doesn't matter. If the car was white versus pale yellow, it doesn't really matter. It's the best the memoirist can do is what we're looking for. And that if the memoirist can stand behind that material, I think that is the best that we can do.
That is, well, unfortunately, we're approaching the top of the hour, but that seems like a wonderful place to wrap it up. Because I've really enjoyed this conversation. Gosh, what a fascinating subject, and it's something that's close to my heart from going through those same experiences. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, Becky. Before Becky tells us where everyone can find Little Avalanches and stuff like that, Craig, do you have any additional questions?
No, I'm good, but I agree. This has been really fascinating to me. It's a really interesting topic, because it's you know, it's still writing, it's still telling, it's still storytelling, but it's so different. It can be so different than just sitting down and making stuff up, which is what a lot of us fiction writers do every day, right? It's, you know, being able to really dig into the details of somebody's life, figure out those core those slices that you talk about that are meaningful and that will resonate with the readers in a way that will, you know, tell them something maybe about themselves or about their own relationships. I think it's a really amazing medium to work in, and I think it's great that you were able to work out, you know, some of your own issues with your family, and I think that's also like probably one of the big reasons why people write memoirs in the first place, to work through some of that stuff. So it's great. And thanks for coming on and being able to share that with us.
Now, where can people find Little Avalanches and find out more about you and everything like that?
So you can go to my website, which is beckyellis.net. So BECKYELLIS.net. And you can find Little Avalanches pretty much anywhere books are sold, favorite bookstores, online, bookshop.org, amazon.com, all that, Barnes & Noble. And before I sign off, what I would like to do is thank both you, Craig and Roland, for this podcast, because we work so hard on writing books. I spent 10 years writing this memoir, and selling books is a completely different thing. And I know you're really helping authors. I've learned a lot from your podcast, and it's a whole different ballgame, writing versus marketing and selling. And discoverability is so hard out there in the marketplace, no matter how you're published. And you do a really good job of kind of guiding writers through that process. So I want to thank you both for doing the work you do.
Oh, that warms my heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, everybody listening to this, hopefully you have found what Becky had to share very, very enlightening and educational. I know I did. It's like one of these podcasts where I walk away with knowing more than I did when we went into it. So please do go and visit her website, check out her book, and we'll pop a link down below in the description so you can find that easily enough. And while you're down there, we've got a big comment section. Why don't you leave Becky a comment and let her know how much you enjoyed what she shared with us today? And while you're down there, you could also hit that like button if you haven't already. Hit that subscribe button. There's even a bell icon you can click so you get notified every time we have a new episode of Fully Booked coming out, which we will do next week. So thank you for joining us this week, and we will see you again very soon.